not with a tour group or anything?
Well, I think we're probably doing both. Probably doing an organized tour for a while. Then we're going to stay longer and do our own thing, I think.
Okay.
And that would be the time I'd want to do that. Yeah.
I'd be happy to talk with you. Yeah, I've been going to Israel for the last 10 years.
Okay. Glad
Good
you're
thing.
wonderful. Thank you.
Hello, Kaz and Debray.
Hello.
So Gordy, just the last 10 years? Oh, no,
Yeah.
no. I thought it was longer than that.
No, I first went, we went to Israel in 2010 on a pilgrimage, but then my wife and I went to Israel to dig in 2012. And it isn't ended. I'm going back this summer, so as long as I can still crawl up the hillside, eventually with my little walker with the tennis balls, I'll keep going up the hill, and then maybe that'll be the time to quit.
It might be motorized, make it a little bit easier.
True. Well, Dick, you just passed on to Gary Fellman your
Exactly.
little thing.
There. Now it's good.
Yeah, it looks like Gary inherited by a nasty video.
You're muted, Gary.
Yeah, I've been unable to get my my Windows 11 machine to get the contrast right. It's a bit more complicated than a 10 machine.
I'm having the same trouble with my contrast, Gary. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, they shifted from a slide to some sort of set of themes, and it just doesn't work as well.
I agree. So I was telling Gordy that my son has been watching our videos, and he said, "I've been enjoying your YouTube uploads. That Gary and Gordy don't mess around," he said. And then he has a bunch of flames.
Oh, I see.
So actually, that's good news. He's impressed.
Oh, all right, well, that's good.
So the flames mean we flamed out or something. Huh, Gary?
No.
Yeah, that's what I assumed.
You set the world on fire.
All right. Hello, Paul. You're
Yeah, I'm here, but I'm silent until I unmute myself.
I see you're advertising your affiliations with.
Well, listen, any contribution, I put my son through, paid for his college education, so all I got is this lousy sweater.
Do you have the decal that says my son and my money went to see you?
Yeah, I don't have that, but I've seen it on automobile stickers, bumpers. Yeah, for sure.
Well, now you got Coach Prime, so all is well, right?
Right, right. We're raring to go. So my son was actually one of the athletic student trainers when he was at school there. So he got a chance not only, and he also played in the band. So he got to go to some bowl games and play at halftime. So it was fun for him.
Nice.
He had a good college education, and he used it to obtain contacts, which he has used to good use since he graduated about 12 years ago or so. So yeah, it's been fun. Sandy, I may want to go ahead, and in fact I will congratulate you. You are an amazing chapter summarizer. Thank you for sending us the notes and having us to try and go ahead, and I don't know which is more challenging, going through your notes or going through the written chapter materials. It's a real dense chapter. And you know, was there someone here who knows Greek and could go ahead? Because that's certainly an integral part of Paul's chapter descriptions is the Greek. Sometimes there's a translation and sometimes not, but it's really.
Gordy has a Greek alphabet on your computer, don't you, Gordy?
I don't know. Roberta was our Greek expert. She unfortunately she decided not to join this class this time. She could have helped a lot. Roberta could have.
Roberta is good.
All right.
You were able, by the way, I hope somebody asks, because there's a term that's sprinkled through the notes, and perhaps our Christian friends can go ahead and talk about PNEUMA, pneuma, and translated very loosely as spirit. And so I'm hoping that since it's included in the notes, that someone can go ahead, perhaps you, perhaps someone else can go ahead and enlighten me as to how that's integral in the discussion.
Well, I think that is what Paula Fredrickson has done that's new. This is a book that I have by her. She's kind of branched out, and I see and Pam Eisenbaum are kind of on the same track. So I picked up some of Pam Eisenbaum's stuff in her writing, but I think the pneuma is something that, because I've never, not that that means anything, but I've never come across that word in description of what was going on with Paul. So I think it's possible that this is her her unique take on Paul.
Okay.
But I don't think it's differs that much from the way we look at Paul as Christians, but certainly I never had looked at that terminology before.
Right. Is it true, or did I read something about Paula Fredrickson as someone who was raised as a Christian and then converted? Is that your understanding?
She was raised as a Roman Catholic and became a Jew, and she teaches at Hebrew University in Jerusalem and also Boston University. So that's a Catholic university and a Jewish university. So she teaches in both of those. She's kind of an interesting person, don't you think?
I think she is.
Yeah. And she got her PhD at Princeton. She taught at Princeton for a while, and Oxford, she got her master's. And I was trying to think where she got her bachelor's. Swarthmore or someplace like that. So she's been to all the right schools.
Getting a little bit of feedback from somebody. Could we all mute unless we want to talk? That would be great. Thank you. Hi, Leslie.
Hi, sorry I'm late.
We talked about you while you weren't here.
It's always the best way.
You're a valued, faithful member. I don't know how many years it's been now, but a long time. And we love you for it. You make it worthwhile for us to get together. So are we ready to start? We ready to launch?
Yep.
So I have this book of Josephus, over 700 pages in 8-point type. And so I was, Gary, I was really wondering if I was totally over my head to even talk about him. So if there's something you want to interject into this conversation, you are welcome to do it. Okay. Josephus also talked so much about the different dynasties, the Maccabean revolt, the Jewish wars, and the Seleucid Empire and the Hasmonean dynasty, and I thought, how am I going to get this straight? And so what he was doing, he was writing about ancient history, not that ancient, but the first century, first 2 centuries BCE. So and he used the Pharisees. When he used them, they were kind of like wallpaper. I think the Pharisees were kind of what Judaism was to him. Does that make sense to you, Gary?
I'm not. I don't think that you can read that much. I'm a little more skeptical about Josephus's connection with the Pharisees.
Yeah, well, you're right to be skeptical because he so rarely even mentions the Pharisees as such. The oral Torah of the Pharisees, well, in Josephus' 30-volume corpus, Pharisees rarely appear, the author says. That observation says something important about any study of Josephus' Pharisees, despite older impressions that Josephus was a Pharisee or that he wrote his later works preoccupied with the group. They are a marginal presence in his corpus. And it seemed to me he was using them as kind of a literary tool, because when he would go in and investigate different historic figures in Jewish history, the Pharisees were always there causing a little bit of trouble. And it seemed to me in the end, I thought maybe that Josephus was using them as kind of a literary tool to make people more interesting. Anybody have a sense of that? Leslie, do you? No? So
I found the whole thing really, the summary, I think gives a good thumbnail to the many, many pages that went before.
Right.
But I do find that you could make several different cases for the different things that he writes in different of his works, because he wrote a lot.
And I think our author in the end wasn't sure if Josephus was a Pharisee or not. He said it could be proved both ways, which I thought was kind of interesting. So a statesman historian, Josephus is concerned mainly with politics and philosophy of government. We might imagine a religion that is called Judaism. That's what I was referring to. And of course, we call them Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes as religious groups or sects. But Josephus knew nothing about that kind of language. So my sense was that, it was a vast milieu out there of Jews, and that I was talking to Gordy the other day about this. I heard a Pew research. This has been about 4 months ago, or maybe longer. And Pew decided in the United States we have 13 different identifiable political parties. So I can imagine that's what we're talking about too, with the Jews during that time. They were many different factions of Jews, and of course they didn't point out that they were who they were exactly, if they were Pharisees, because let's see if I can tell you how.
We just got a new political party in Colorado that I wish I could remember the name, but I read about it, and they now can put forth candidates at will without every time having to go through the process of, getting enough signatures, et cetera. This was just last week. So we now have, I think, 5 or 6 political parties in the state of Colorado.
And there probably are more. There are some that are, more that are Democrats that are more into the environment, and there are Republicans that are into the environment. So, I think that's what Pew Research was talking about. Let's see, I'm trying to find a quote here about how many that he thinks that perhaps the Pharisees were something like 1% of the population when he did a scan of the population. So, because they were probably, according to the best research they have, that perhaps 500,000 Jews, and then there were other people that were on the periphery at the time. And so when he came down to pointing out how many there were of each sect, they were very, very insignificant. So, but we don't know. We don't know. It's possible that, you know, Dobre, tell me what you think about that.
Paul had a question, Sandy. Paul has his hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to go ahead and perhaps help with a little bit of the backstory of how Josephus wound up in Rome. I think he originally was one of the priest leaders of the revolt, and I think he was captured, and
Right.
then as he was captured by some of the Roman army, I think because either of his status as a sort of a priest or certainly some important figure, I think he was taken prisoner and apparently must have ingratiated himself with the Roman legions and Titus, and he wound up basically being transported and being held in sort of as a kept hostage in Rome. And he attempted to go ahead and write the history as he understood it, but he was very careful, I think, to go ahead and give credit, and was a little bit the word that I'm thinking of is obsequious as a writer, and writing about the Jewish wars and the antiquities. I think he was very careful to avoid offending his Roman, the generals and the people in Rome, and especially Titus. And so that's where you have to begin to go ahead, I think, and take Josephus's writings as, you know, the best we have, but understand that he was anxious not to antagonize his Roman captors.
And if I remember correctly, with the fall of the temple, he was in Roman hands. What was his name? Vespian, and Titus. You were talking about Titus, which
Vespasian.
Vespasian.
Yeah,
So that must have.
I
That
was gonna
must
say
a tragedy.
Vespasian wasn't in and around Jerusalem when the temple fell. He was actually basically in Rome, on his way to Rome to become emperor. So it wasn't. It was Titus.
And so he was hired probably as a translator for Titus. And
Yeah, he tells great stories about him, about circling the walls, asking the people to surrender in the name of, and them throwing rocks and shooting arrows at him. It must have been all, quite exciting in some ways.
you remember when we did the study, the Jews and Jesus Sandmill, where we did text criticism. I thought the text criticism part about Josephus was fascinating because the text criticism scholarship, let's see, we have, okay, the text criticism, he relocated to Rome in time for the Flavian triumph in June 71 CE. Later in the decade, the Emperor Vespasian, help me out with that word, Vespasian and his co-regent son Titus enjoy the destruction of Jerusalem, calling it the end of a foreign threat. As priest aristocrat from Jerusalem, Josephus, who knew both sides of the conflict, which you were referring to, Gary, intimately after facing Vespasian in the field and spending the bulk of the war as a Roman captive, Josephus is in a unique position to give the balanced, truthful account of the Historia that the Historia recommends. So there's a lot of biblical criticism and I think I'm most aware of the biblical criticism of Josephus on page 1. So we recalled Samuel and how he was able to dissect Christian and Jewish texts. And so there's a source critical approach to Josephus, alleging that he has taken on different political and religious alliances over time in his writing. So, for example, he said little about the Pharisees and Judean war written in the 70s and reflecting this pre-70 conditions, but he knew well because there was little to say about this marginalist group. So he changes his alliances throughout his writings. And there are a lot of writings. I mean, I don't know how many years he was writing this, but between the Antiquities and the Judean war, there's a lot of years. So he sort of augmented his Judean war text, and also he fleshes out the Pharisees a little bit more as sort of interesting troublemakers that, you know, cause a little bit of trouble in all of these different dynasties. So back to the outline, Josephus identity as a priest, and by the way, he wasn't always identified in Wikipedia as a priest, but he, in this book, as a priest, aristocrat, statesman, and historian, is unmistakable and frequently asserted, but there is no reason to link him with Pharisees, and the author says, and many reasons not to. And I think in the end, he was it's kind of like a Greek tragedy. He was leaving it up to the reader to decide whether Josephus was really a Pharisee in the end. So, so they're a marginal presence in Josephus' works. Josephus' accounts of the Pharisees are consistent throughout. He agrees with all three schools on various points. The Pharisees' influence in the extra-biblical tradition of Moses' laws, their reputation for precise interpretation, their tendency toward leniency in punishments, their popularity with the masses are such that Jerusalem's jurisprudence follows Pharisaic principles even when the magistrates are Sadducees. So notable Pharisees accordingly take their place along with the chief priests, which Josephus finds in his ancestry. I think that there's kind of because Josephus was the son of a priest, and I think that he was also sort of an aristocrat. I think that I have the impression that he was kind of a little bit confused in terms of, not confused in a bad way, but that he was taking on both the aristocracy of the Sadducees and the commonality, the common people. So does anybody have another impression of him than that? Josephus' Pharisees appear as legal experts concerned with careful interpretations of the law, not the humorless legalism that Christians laid on them. Josephus disdained Pharisees as he prides himself in being an expert interpreter of the laws as a priest. And that Pharisees leveraged their influence to exert power with no concern for justice, as when they strove to have him, a priest appointed by chief priests, unseated by the chief priests in Galilee. So there's a lot of political intrigue, a lot of battles that are going on in Josephus' books. And you wonder, as a writer of history, if he projected a lot of what he had experienced personally onto the characters in the books. Do you think so, Ann Cohen? She understands the writer. You're still muted.
Still on mute.
What did you ask me?
I was just asking you if you thought he was projecting his own experience on his characters.
Oh, projecting them?
Uh-huh.
Well, it's possible. I found this very dense, and what I find when I read this is that nobody really knows exactly what happened.
Right. Including
that's my general feeling about all this.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of writing because you really don't know, and you don't know who to trust, whose word to trust, and they apparently had a big influence because the temple had been destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a continuation of Judaism. It was really a disaster when that happened because people were used to, going there to meet God and to sacrifice. And now there was no place to do that. That was traumatic. And so,
This is a transition place for the Jewish community and for the Christ followers.
The what followers?
Well, they call themselves the way. They were mostly Jewish Christians. But
I see. So following Christ.
It was a transition, a major transition time for both the Jews and Christians. So
and it's very confusing. It's interesting they say he didn't have the idea of sects. SECTS is the idea of different Jews the way we do now in religions. We have different Baptists and Presbyterians and all this, and then we have Jews, Reformed, Conservative. It wasn't that way then. It was very different. And so
that's why it's kind of a blank screen in terms of
it is. I don't have a real sense. I just have a sense when I read this that nobody really knows completely what was happening.
Well, when you get to the end of the book, you will be assured of that because
yes, and I was reading my chapter. I thought, well, this is nobody knows what
That's on purpose.
So it doesn't come clear by the end of the book, huh?
So do you think that God wants people not to be so doggone sure of themselves?
Maybe a little humility will be good.
Yeah.
A little bit questioning what's going on. I think that happens as you get older. You people aren't all getting older, but I'm getting older. And I question more, what's going on. Just like that, because there's so many things that we don't expect to happen and we have beyond our control.
And also it's hard to be absolutely certain when we can see so many other possibilities, right?
That's right. And especially with the internet and so forth. I mean, there's so much information flying around that you can't know. Really.
Sandy, Gary has his hand up.
Yeah.
Gary, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I mean, to build on that point that we really don't know what was going on. I think first, I've always thought of Josephus as a man of Jerusalem, right? Except for the short period of time when he was sent north to
The
you know, to
Galilee.
basically, help defend Galilee against the Romans, and right, and of course he made that famous trip to Rome. He pretty much living in Washington D.C. You pretty much have a sense there are people who are capital people, right? They hang around Washington D.C. and they're really into which groups are battling for influence over other groups, and that was Josephus's, environment,
Mhm.
right? To get a sense of, and maybe Gordy would know for sure, but a good sign of how these various sects penetrated the rest of the country is to sort of count how many mikvahs, how many ritual baths have been discovered outside of the Jerusalem area and outside of areas with Herodian palaces, which are really extensions of Jerusalem. And the numbers, I believe, are really very low, right? And people will say, oh, they were nicking down to the lake or jumping in the river. Not always, right? I think it's, I think that, as you said, these groups were just not that influential outside of the capital city, but that's where Josephus's head was.
Mhm.
And so and it's really, I think we have to be careful, and always read it with that, and you get a sense of that when you're in Washington D.C., with people whose heads are very much into the kind of power politics that just fills the streets here. It's but the rest of the country, I don't think it was quite like this.
Well, we have our own struggles, the rest of the country. So, and also I think that the author Mason says that, it's hard to tell how much was the influence of the Pharisees and how much was just cultural. The baths he referred to as maybe just was a cultural thing in the Jewish community. So, and even went into the garments and the fringe and all of that sort of thing, how Jesus wore fringe on his garment. So in their attitudes, however, the New Testament texts differ among themselves as well. Mark, Matthew, and John in different ways present the Pharisees as lethally opposed to Jesus. And Jesus and they mutually reject each other's authority. And Luke's Pharisees, by the way, keep inviting him to dinner. And that was something I think that Jerry brought up a couple of weeks ago. Inviting him to dinner, even though he consistently criticizes them. They respected him as a teacher. They warned him to leave the Galilee to escape Herod Antipas and accompanied him as he entered Jerusalem. Luke's Jesus considers them righteous or just, faulting them chiefly for exclusiveness and Pharisee and hypocrisy, as they in turn are scandalized by Jesus keeping bad company, the prostitutes and tax collectors. So they had arguments with each other. Sadducean temple authorities detained and executed Jesus. The paradoxical upshot, according to this author, is that the 2-volume Christian work, and I think he's talking about Luke and Acts, seems more accepting of the Pharisees than the Judean priest aristocrat Josephus works. Both Jesus and the Pharisees work among the common people, distinguish themselves sharply from the temple-based priestly authorities. So I think that, it seems to me our author was a little bit ambivalent at the end, thinking that Josephus himself probably he wasn't going to admit it, but he may have been a Pharisee because the culture that they imbued on the world was profound. And I think that is a good segue into the discussion of Paul on page 6. I was going to quote something, but I guess it's someplace else in there. Paul is the only self-identified Pharisee in the period from whom some writings remained. I have to say that this was an exciting study for me, and I think Fredrickson that you took sort of a different take on Paul, because I have wondered forever in reading Paul what his influence was that made him so eloquent, so absolutely beautifully a writer. And of course, what he was writing about was the eternal life, about resurrection. And that was all. He got all of that from the Pharisees. Resurrection. And he writes so beautifully about it. And also, I think that when we look at Fredrickson, I think she makes a little bit of reference to a Greek influence, and I would say there's a Celtic influence also on Paul. But mostly, he was reflective of resurrection that he was really steeped in terms of the Pharisees. How do you all feel about that? For that to be something that he's so profoundly attached to.
Oh, the resurrection?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't work for me, but I'm I'm a Reformed Jew. I don't get.
You're not a good Pharisee.
Yeah.
Are you a Sadducee?
I have no idea.
Paul, what were you going to say?
I was going to go.
Leslie had a question.
It's both of us. It's fine.
Well, what I thought was interesting was his way of describing the resurrection on a slightly different topic that Paul Fredrickson was talking about. And she made it clear from her reading that there was a difference between what happens to your soul if you were a bad person. You wouldn't go ahead and be resurrected, but if you were a good person, the idea that I got out of this was that your good deeds were and your reward was transferred to another individual. And I had never gone ahead and thought of it that way. I thought that the Ha'olam Haba, the so-called coming days, the world to come, really meant that you had sort of a seat at the angels and at God's table, not that your soul and that your good deeds would be transferred to an individual, another individual person. So that was surprising to me. Does anybody have that reading of?
I got that too, Paul, and I kind of skipped over that into the Christian. So it's sort of Hindu in having and taking on another life depending on your this life, right? So and I think that there's a lot of that in Buddhism as well, in the going through the bardos of how you're suffering according to what you need to learn out of the whole process. So yeah, I think that was great that you picked that up, because I kind of skipped over that thinking, wow, this goes into a whole different realm. Yeah. Thank you for that. Paul. Leslie?
A couple of things. We first encounter the idea of resurrection of the dead in both Christian and Jewish philosophy. I think we both get it from Greek, from the Greek philosophy. The way we borrow things depending on where we're living. And as Anne mentioned, it didn't, as Judaism evolved, it kind of played itself out of the more liberal sects, but it appears in the prophets. And so it's not foreign to Judaism. There's also a concept and I can't remember where it appears. I wish I could, because then it would have more weight to it, called The Rolling of Souls, which has got a hint of reincarnation to it. But I don't think that the idea of resurrection is so out of whack that it didn't fit into this time frame. I don't think it was it wasn't poo-pooed by the people, because no matter where you fell in this spectrum of early Christianity and the time when the temple was destroyed and everything was up in arms, or everything was so confusing, that was an idea that many of the people could grasp. And it was an idea that had hope in it, even if your day-to-day life was really, really difficult.
You know, I was thinking, Anne, when we went, when we're talking about mythology and how the same stories seem to come out of different peoples over time. And I think that resurrection probably is something that was a myth that the human species had very early in the game. So we're not sure.
It was actually one of the myths that was an early Native American myth that had to do with that Camel talks about in relation to the white buffalo, and even having a little bit of the buffalo, then the master of the heavens could create a new buffalo. So you're right, it's been around a long time.
And so I like to think that, you know, God was in charge from the very start, putting these hopes in people's souls, and also the ability to raise ourselves in terms of our ethical approach to each other. So, so that's the way sort of I make sense of prehistory, and you know, our history has been fairly recent compared to all that. So the result of the reception of Christ's pneuma for both groups, this pneuma, Paul urges the Jews also need Christ's pneuma. Christ had a pneumatic body, and Christ's pneuma is in them, empowering to heal, prophetically speak in angelic tongues, and that's what I love about Paul is his angelic tongues, and control lower and lesser spirits, which confirms Paul and his colleagues in their conviction that Christ is soon to return and that the end of ages is at hand. So do you remember when we were talking about Pam Eisenbaum's book, how Pam was very emphatic that Paul thought the end was coming, and so Paul wanted to tell the Gentiles about God before the end. So, and we got that from the Christians got that from the Jewish tradition itself. The Jewish tradition was talking about the end times. So the result of the reception of Christ's pneuma for both groups, Israel and not Israel, is knowing what time is on God's clock. That is the significance of trusting in Jesus' identity as the risen and soon returning Messiah. Both Christ groups live according to Jewish law, our author says, Jews in their way, Gentiles in theirs, until cosmic forces are subdued. Eschatological transformation into spiritual body is complete. The Messiah gives the kingdom to the divine Father, and God is all in all. In this ethnic sense, that Paul presents a double Torah, a law of works and a law of trust, teleos, the ultimate aim being trust. Both refer to the law of Moses, different facets of Torah itself. Paul was deeply committed to living according to the Pharisaic tradition, she says. Paul's reception of Christ in him turned him from an antagonist to an apostle. Paul refers to this reception of Christ as a revelation and as his prophetic call, not a conversion. Remember when Pam Eisenbach talked about that Paul was called, not converted, because she was using Paul's writings. She was not using the book of Acts in terms of his history. So she never, as far as I was ever with her in class, she never used the book of Acts as a part of Paul's history. Paul's reception of Christ in him then turned him into an apostle. So to this end, Paul continued to esteem his ancestral teaching, his paradosis, traditional teaching, specifically Pharisaic conviction based on this teaching was belief in resurrection. As Josephus said, Pharisees held that every soul is imperishable and that the souls of the good pass into another body. And that's what Gary was talking about. Sounds a little bit like reincarnation, Gary. Yes, I agree with that. So Paul the Pharisee interprets Josephus' account of pneumatic resurrection. The body of flesh is changed, not shed, at resurrection. Those in Christ who have Christ's pneuma, both the quick and the dead, will themselves transform soon into bodies of the pneuma. And I think this is where she's kind of broken with traditional teaching, although it makes sense to me, and I certainly, but I think the pneuma came, and somebody, was that you, Leslie, said that maybe it had a Greek influence to it, the pneuma. So consequently, we have these beautiful passages, which we in our Christian tradition often use when we do memorials, funerals. This is what Paul said: it is raised a physical body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a physical body, there's also a spiritual body. Listen, I will tell you a mystery. We will not all die. We will all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will walk, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will all be changed. So do you see the Pharisees in that? Leslie, what do you think?
It's really specific. And as you can tell from some of the studies that we've been studying together for a long time, that the Jewish idea of some concepts are not that concrete. I mean, Ezekiel may talk about it, when he talks about the valley of the dry bones and getting up and walking.
Resurrection right there, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. But from a day-to-day part of my belief system, it's not that concrete. Like Paul talks about, I believe in something that's that we describe in the word as the world to come and your place in it. And the idea of a soul, which I do think comes from Greek philosophy, but I could be mistaken. I just think that's where it originated.
Soul in Deuteronomy.
Yes. And so if you ask me that, if that's how I view it, I'm not sure, because that's very concrete. which happens, I think, in a number of Christian writings that are very concrete, and have a harder time with those than in a more not so specific conception.
And I personally think that a lot of the mystery of our faith is not concrete.
Yeah, I think so too, for all of us.
Belief. It's
That's right.
it's a hope. It's a belief.
That's right. I agree. That's right.
So Rabbi Gerson started a new class that Gordy was at a few days ago. And one of the questions that we talked about was, what do you have faith in? And how faith is different than belief. And I think that could fit in here somewhere too. Things that we have faith in without having a really hardcore specific vision of what it's supposed to look like.
So one of the helpful things for me has been, because I think I don't, it's kind of a head thing about faith and belief. I like to think of it as faith as faithfulness, which faithfulness brings us to understanding and seeing and believing. And I can't remember the name of the author, maybe Nina has can remember, but wrote that belief is really beloving. The origin of the word is beloving God. So beloving God by being faithful. So that to me that's been more helpful than trying to have an intellectual concept of the belief in the faith. So so Paul thought of himself as a flawless Pharisee now that he was in Christ and Christ in him. His opinion of himself never diminished, of course not. He realized now how the law pointed ahead to Christ in Romans 10. He excelled at speaking in angelic tongues. This is what I love about Paul, his angelic tongues. And he excelled at charismata, at prophecy, at deeds of power, at signs, wonders, and demonstrations of spirit. Through his efforts, ex-pagan communities validated his own powers by being empowered by spirit to perform these charismata as well. He understood that the end of ages had arrived. Salvation is nearer now, and now that Christ lived in him. Paul could only be an even better Pharisee, an even better reader of scripture, an even better interpreter of the rules of the fathers, an even better teacher of resurrection, who has known the mind of the Lord. His answer lies throughout all his letters. He does. He knows the mind of the Lord. Presumption, perhaps. I think some think that Paul has been a little presumptuous. So one thing I was looking for is here, the connection with Gamaliel and Hillel Academy. And this is the New Testament Pharisees of the Gospels, which is on page 8. The reconciling Pharisee Gamaliel, teacher of the law, in honor of all people, advises the council to let the movement be. So this is the way they're behaving in Book of Acts. In Acts, Paul is the apostle to Gentiles and to Jews as well. Later, other Christ-following Pharisees form a significant block within the Jerusalem-based community. So partisans of resurrection. Luke's Pharisees play a positive role in the post-crucifixion community. Is cosmological and moral polarities structuring John's gospel? Pharisees represent the dark side in that gospel. And John's Jerusalem-centered story, scarcely in the Galilee, depicts hostile encounters between those who belong to Jesus and those who do not. John's Pharisees, together with the chief priests, condemn Jesus to death. We talked about that. And then there is an exception in the book of John about the conversation he had with Nicodemus. He told Nicodemus that he needed to be born again, and Nicodemus said, "That's absurd. I can't be born again." And Jesus was taking that to have a different meaning. I had some statistics here, which I wanted to share with you, which I think is interesting. There's a whole lot of that may be of interest also in terms of Christian scholarship over time. So it's a fact that in Christian scholarship over time, the bad news was centuries of Gentile Christian antagonistic rhetoric and other aspects of Pauline canonical corpus. And all of these that are listed here were written or pseudonymously written. So they revealed advertisement to the Jews. In addition, church fathers, and this is what I thought was fascinating. Ignatius of Antioch, around 100 in the Common Era. Tertullian, who died in 220 Common Era. Marcion, who died 160. Chrysostom died 407. Augustine, 430. Antagonistically juxtaposed Jesus and Christians. In other words, all of those church fathers that we have in Christianity, somebody had written that they thought that that it was that they had not experienced in their own church tradition anti-Semitism, but I think in some sense it is written into our history. I thought that was fascinating that she's a historian basically by trade, had pulled up all of those cases. So yes, it permeates our tradition. Let's see. Here we go. Under Herod the Great, Josephus claimed that the Pharisees had roughly 6,000 followers. How in the world they knew that, since we don't even know who they were. Essenes numbered around 4,000, and temple personnel and priests like Josephus and Levites numbered at roughly 20,000. I would say that's excessive, wouldn't you, for priests and Levites? There's no certainty about these figures, but if modern historians lowest guess about population within Herod's borders to be roughly 500,000 Jews, Pharisees would be like 1.2% of the whole around Jerusalem. So less in the percentage of the larger populations. And so if we take Josephus' word as the last word, Pharisees concentrated around Jerusalem didn't appear to be a large part of the population or that influential for that matter. I think Gary was talking about there weren't that influential in his opinion. So according to Josephus, widespread populations in Jerusalem and Judea under Hasmonean monarchs, and Herod had great regimes, 37 to 4 BCE, accepted Pharisaic teachings and ways of life, and even Jerusalem Sadducees priesthood accepted the Pharisaic practice, whether they wanted to or not. He does that a little bit tongue in cheek. Though some Pharisees point out that chief priests who were de facto rulers in Jerusalem and that Josephus' Pharisees were wealthy, powerful aristocrats. So Josephus is kind of crosses the line in his own history, who easily deferred to the Jewish contemporaries. There is a question about how much clout these Pharisees actually had. So if we want to define the Pharisees, if we want to define them, they were people that were considered to be the most accurate and precise interpreters of the law. And Josephus also mentions that the Pharisees attribute everything to fate and to God while leaving a place for the individual's initiative in cooperation with fate. the soul, according to Josephus, is imperishable. So we've done that part. So I was thrilled to be able to connect Paul to his past, to what he was doing, and he elaborated on it. Would you say?
Mhm.
It must be feel like futility for anybody like Pam Eisenbaum to be studying Paul, because there's so little that we can nail down. And I think Paul, kind of like Josephus, was a chameleon in a way. He adapted to the different communities that he was found in. So, any other thoughts? About Numa?
Well, I think that Numa, I get the impression from the discussion that Numa is an exquisitely Christian concept. It's not that Jews don't have a feeling and a deep understanding of the idea of spirit and how that influences what and how we react to our fellow man. But to my mind, it seems to be an important ingredient in Christian theology. And so I would go ahead and say that that's what I got out of the chapter summaries that you so generously provided us, that spirit is an important issue. It's just not the issue, because we as Jews really talk about works. And I suspect that Christianity can go ahead and eventually get to works, but faith seems to be critical for the Christian community, and Numa as a spiritual add-on is very important in Christian faith. That's what I got out of tonight's discussion.
Let me ask you in the Shema, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. How are you defining the soul?
I'll give it a stab. Okay, my soul is the part of me that is not physical.
Yeah.
It is, we can either be thought of as bodies with souls or souls with bodies. And it's not, either those definitions are not exactly the same.
I would define it on a personal level as the essence of who you are, the soul.
I think
not
that
the physical body, the essence.
Deborah, I think that is a contemporary way that I've been attaching to it, is that even a little creature like my beautiful cats have souls. It's the essence of who they are. They're ensouled. But I'm not sure if this is what was intended in Deuteronomy. But I think it's an interesting word. I'm sorry, Roberta's not here to look it up for us. And so what is your heart and your soul? And your might, that is what how you manifest it, right?
Yeah.
Those descriptions, your heart and your soul and your might is to encompass all of you. So your heart was thought to be where your intellect lay. We think of it now as your head, but at that time it was your heart. And so talking about your heart and your soul and your strength and your might that's all of you. So every little particle of you is involved in this endeavor.
And probably we're wrestling with a tradition, with a Bible that is may or may not be translating it very well too, you know.
I think it's right.
I like what Deborah said about the essence of the creature. The essence. So we all are ensouled. And maybe our heart has to do with our emotion.
Often contemporaneously, what people talk about is the physical, as Leslie said, the emotion, and then the soul is your essence. The three of them being what Leslie was saying, the total of who we are.
And so the might is getting out there and acting faithfully, living faithfully. So are we ready to have a benediction? Who wants to give a benediction? I bet Leslie could give a good one.
I'm not sure it'll be such a good one, but I would hope that my prayer is that we all share in our love for one another and our hope for our communities, and work toward making the world a better place.
Absolutely. Thank you. What a beautiful thought. Thank you so much, Leslie. Thank you, everybody. Stay warm. Don't slide on the ice.
Thank you,
Yes.
Sandy, so much.
Thank you, Sandy.
Thank you,
Sandy,
Sandy. Thank you.
Thanks
so
for all
much.
the work you put into this. Thank you so much.
Yes,
You're welcome.
thank you. And
Pleasure.
stay well, everybody.
Okay, we'll do that.
Sandy, Sandy, what's up for next week? Which chapters?
Oh my
Do you know?
gosh.
Kaz is our facilitator next week with chapter 18, is it right?
Yes.
I'm going to talk about Martin Luther, which
Thank
I'm
you.
talking about tonight, but there was a lot about Martin Luther in there.
Thank you. I look forward to it.
Look forward to it, Kaz.
Have a good week, Kaz. Bye.
Thank you. Take care.